Good morning, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are, whatever you're up to. Surprise, surprise, we are playing some Golgari again. The deck is still just about the most fun I've had in Modern, and we're here on the draw with a hand that is pretty great in the dark, right? We don't know what we're against. This is pretty great. We have a threat. We have a very good threat. And we have a lot of very good interaction. Pretty much no matter what our opponent is up to, these three cards will cover our bases pretty well. And we have the archetypally perfect balance of 3 lands to 4 spells. Again, in a blind match, this is pretty much all you can ask for. It is worth noting we currently lack double black, but literally any other land in our deck will be either a black source, something that can find a black source, or Field of Ruin, which can find a black source, as long as they're not on mono basics. So this is a great keep. Our opponent's happy too, so let's get it underway. Inkmoth Nexus, Welding Jar, Mox Opal, alright, and Animation Module. Excuse me. So up until that Animation Module, this could have been regular old Affinity, but now we know that it is Modular Affinity or Hardened Scales Affinity, depending on what you prefer to call it. So they're both go-wide artifact decks that use a lot of really powerful synergies, like playing a 0 mana accelerant that depends upon having a bunch of artifacts in play, which they want to do anyway. So the basic principle of both decks is the same, but Animation Module is one that's only seen in Hardened Scales, and this one gets you extra value out of putting counters on your permanents, and it can also add to the overall number of those counters. This is kind of emblematic of the deck. The deck tries to really use the card Hardened Scales to abuse all of the low mana cost artifacts that thrive on counters being added onto things, or that get counters themselves. So lots of counter related shenanigans there, but in terms of how to approach the matchup, it's pretty similar to regular Affinity. We have to be low on our curve. Kill spells are great, but we also have to present a clock as well. Let's see what they do. Alright, so they play a Steel Overseer. This is one of their big payoff cards. They do need other creatures around for it to be good, though, but still definitely something we want to answer as soon as possible. Now, we're going to Fatal Push this, even though they can regen it with the Welding Jar, just to get the Welding Jar off the table. However, right away we have kind of a weird thing happen that our opponent just lets it happen. Our opponent did message me and say, hey, why didn't it let me regen? I think they might have just F6'd without realizing it, or maybe there is a bug, I don't know. Either way, we did have an out to the Overseer with Collective Brutality. -2/-2 is not something that regen can stop. So we did still have an out, might not change the game radically. That said, it does allow us to play this Inquisition here, which is really nice, without having to Brutality that. Alright, so we see a nice hand. We're not going to take the redundant Mox Opal, so do we take the Walking Ballista or the Steel Overseer? I think in this case we just want to take the Overseers. Walking Ballista is not that scary played early, and they will be incentivized to play it early against our discard deck. Now if they find a Hardened Scales off the top, that could change things, but for now I'm pretty happy with that take. And you know, there would be many situations where this game is just basically over because we've answered a couple early plays, and they're a very synergy dependent deck. They could just brick on some draws, right? So we're feeling pretty strong. We're pretty far ahead right now. But the fact that they aggressively cash in this Mox Opal means they might have some good stuff going on here. Let's see what it is. It's going to be a Walking Ballista, and then they want the mana free to get the Animation Module trigger, make a servo. Okay. Fair enough. They have 1 unknown in hand. Okay. We have double black now, so that is nice. I think we still want to be proactive here, though. Liliana Edict kills a servo, and then they are free to just attack her with Walking Ballista. That is not ideal. It eventually, like, Liliana is a little medium in this matchup because there are a lot of situations where she just does just Edict for a servo. Ticking her up here is not very good either. We don't want to pitch a fourth land. We don't want to pitch any of the stuff in hand. It's all pretty good. So, we want to at least put a kind of a meat shield down, so next turn if we do Edict the Lily, they cannot just freely attack her off the board. This is also the more proactive line. The Scoos has a lot of things to gobble up. It's going to have more. So a 3/3 Scoos is pretty safe from anything they could top deck this turn. And I think that is the clear play here. Alright, Hangerback Walker is a good one. It's a very good kind of grindy card in the matchup. Again, it works well with all their various synergies that they have going on. They are not able to trigger Animation Module here, though, because they're still only on 2 mana. Tireless Tracker is never really a bad draw, but in this situation, it's actually something we don't really want to see. We are already ahead on resources. We're likely to stay that way. We just want to be ruthless now. We just want to close out the game and to stay ahead on board as much as possible. Tracker doesn't really help us do that, so we will continue to really lean heavily on the Scavenging Ooze. We still don't want to quite deploy Lily because then Scoos has to block, possibly. So we're going to keep the board clear. You could have hit Ballista or Hanger back either way, in my opinion. Maybe it is better to hit the Hanger back before it gets out of control, because this is a really good value card, right? It produces a lot of bodies, but it really depends on what they top deck to some degree. And either way, I'm pretty happy to just remove a thing, get in with the Ooze, and gobble up a bunch of stuff after they decline to assign a block. So we're establishing a bit of a buffer as far as our life total is concerned. We've established a real clock. We've got a 5/5 cracking in every turn that can grow even bigger. It's now pretty much immune to anything they might have in the main deck. As far as removal goes, which as far as I know is probably just Walking Ballista. I don't know if Dismember floats around their 75 at all, but feeling pretty good about where my Scoos is as far as a big threat goes. So, they find another Walking Ballista, so like I said, some of those games would have just about ended after we really aggressively, fatal push into Inquisition early on. This one's not ending. They've got the grindy value of Animation Module, just producing a lot of chump blockers, basically, and things that they can sacrifice to Liliana, and they're continuing to find gas off the top. That said, our draw has been pretty great, too. The tracker is still looking a little awkward, but Fatal Push is good. And we're happy to just main phase stuff. We're just gonna use our spells, and we're just gonna get in with our 5/5, force a block here. Again, trying to stay ahead on board, trying to keep the board clear. Still haven't had a very good window to resolve Liliana. So here we are very happy to continue being proactive by deploying the Tassiger. We leave a Fatal Push in the yard in case his ability becomes relevant. That's a really good one to buy back. Collective Brutality would have been fine too, but we've still got some clunkers in our hands, so we just err on the side of efficiency and leave the cheaper spell in the bin. Alright, our opponent is kind of at the mercy of their top deck, and they find an Ancient Stirrings. That is a good one. That is a very good one, and they find Arcbound Ravager off the top. This is one of the hardest cards to deal with. It's going to get value when it dies. It's going to bounce a bunch of the counters around. Thankfully, they cannot quite make another servo because they had to Stirrings before they could cast the Ravager, but they're finding good stuff off the top. There's no doubt about it. Alright, so Let's begin by cracking in with our two creatures. We are kind of bluffing some more removal here, so it does not really incentivize them to try to get too cute with their blocks and try to play a bunch of tricks with Arcbound Ravager, because they could get blown out pretty hard. So, respecting that, they just throw a chump blocker in the way, which they're pretty happy to do because they just get to feed the Ravager with that and save 5 damage. Our Tassiger puts them to 11, and, you know, as much as it's an ingrained instinct to play Tracker into land here for the clue value, again, that's not this type of matchup. We've just got to stay ahead on board. If they have another really powerful top deck, and we took the turn off of interacting, we would be very, very punished for it, potentially. So, our opponent will actually sack the Ravager, so we're very, very happy to get that off the field. That said, I understand why they did it, because this Hangerback Walker is the best defensive creature they have. And keeping that around and sinking more resources into that makes total sense. We get to grow the Skoos. And yeah, with how important ending the game is quickly, I'm pretty happy to just deploy our manland there. Again, going against all of the instincts developed over dozens or indeed hundreds of games with this deck. We are not leaning on the Tracker for once. So they end step, kill the Lily with Walking Ballista. Not particularly necessary. They could have waited to see what they draw, but it's a Horizon Canopy. They'll cash it in, and they'll find another Arcbound Ravager. Alright, so definitely finding some good stuff off the top, our opponent, but so are we. Assassin's Trophy, any removal here is pretty great. So, once again, not messing around, we're just going to main phase it. We're just going to get the Ravager off the field. Feels a little bit counterintuitive because this thing is going to be a really big value play for them when it eventually kind of bursts. But with all the life gain from Skoos, with how big our threats are, I think I can beat a bunch of Thopter tokens without it being too much of an issue. Really, truly do. And yeah, our opponent is finally saying, I can't afford to take any more hits. Time to assign the block. So we get to gobble up some stuff in response. They get to add a counter in response. We're gobbling up more things. The Ooze is going to end this little chain on the stack as an 8/8. Our opponent's Walker ends as a 6/6. They make 6 Thopters. I mean, the value's incredible for sure, but again, these are things I can beat. They find an Arcbound Worker off the top. And they realize that they're never going to win through the Scavenging Ooze life gain here. So, while it is pretty free for them to send in a bunch of these attacks, and there's no reason not to, the crucial thing they did here is start sending in the Infector. Infect damage is now definitely their path to victory, which is another reason I didn't really care about all these Thopters so much. Because I'm not really in danger of losing 2 non-infect damage sources. Also, Maelstrom Pulse is a fantastic draw here. That is an out as well. So we're gonna keep growing the Skoos on the end step. And we draw another Skoos. Here we're running into a problem of, threats that are a little clunky in this progression. The deck here, Golgari, is designed to ride 1 or 2 threats to victory while interacting heavily. So kind of by definition, if you're finding like 4 of your real threats, they're going to be clunky. Right? They're just going to be clunky because that's just how the deck is operating. They get some nice value here. They get to chump block with an Arcbound Worker as well as a Thopter, and the Worker is going to buff their Inkmoth Nexus. So, while I did just kind of complain about the clunkiness of our threats, it is going to be really nice to just have a bunch of stuff here to play that means they're Army of chump blocking Thopters will only take them so far. And to that end, they are leaving them all back, cracking us for 2 infect. And passing with an unknown card in hand, I believe. Unknown in hand. Field of Ruin, great draw. Great draw. This is why I like to play 4 of these, even though in my previous video, you could see how clunky they can be at times. Just the access to 4 of these is so crucial and so powerful against Inkmoth Nexus decks, against Control, against BGX Mirrors, where manlands end up being a real role player, and just for making Tireless Tracker that much better with additional landfall triggers. It's just a thing of beauty. So we pretty clearly are on the Field of Ruin plan this turn as far as using most of our mana is concerned. That said, we might as well crack a clue first, see what's up, make our tracker bigger. Collective Brutality, okay. I can live with that draw. It could provide a little bit of reach if it ends up coming to that, helping us get around the chump blockers further. But yeah, seeing this wave of gigantic creatures coming at them, having what's probably a dead card in hand, maybe another Mox Opal or something, and with Field of Ruin as an out to Inkmoth, our opponent just sees the writing on the wall, and they will scoop it up. So, good game, well played. The Fatal Push play at the beginning might have set them back a little bit further than would have happened in paper. Again, whether it was a little buggy something or other with the interface, or whether they just accidentally F6'd or they just missed it, I don't know. Again, we did have an out to that, but it allowed me to Inquisition instead of Brutality next turn, and that was pretty huge. That said, I think our opponent still would have had a nice high value take with that Inquisition. Might not have changed the texture of the game all that much. And at the end of the day, we were in a really commanding position. No matter how that sequence went, they had enough gas and enough value with Animation Module on the field using their spare mana that I don't think they would have fired up the Nexus until the stage of the game when they did anyway. And we had the Field of Ruin to answer it. We were really far ahead. We didn't have that much infect on the board. They're never killing us as far as regular damage goes. And our board is gigantic. So, pretty commanding win. And this might be a pretty decent matchup for us. You know, we do have a lot of spot removal, and perhaps more importantly, we have a lot of catch-all removal cards like Trophy, Decay, and Pulse that let us hit the non-creature permanents, if like Hardened Scales, if that becomes the priority target. And of course, 4 Field of Ruin is going to go a long way. That said, this deck is still really explosive, really powerful, and can kind of also blank interaction, or not blank it, but make it less good with a lot of their triggered and activated abilities. So let's go to the sideboard, see how we are going to kit out against Hardened Scales. Okay, my friends, we are here looking at the sideboard against Hardened Scales, and right off the bat, Engineered Explosives is a fantastic card. Fantastic card. This is going to potentially hit just about everything in their deck. They play very, very few permanents, to my knowledge, if any, above CMC2. So whether they have a lot of tokens in Mox Opals on 0, whether they have a lot of their 1-drops, or whether they have a lot of their high-value 2-drops, which is where their value really kind of concentrates, Engineered Explosives is a fantastic card. Potential for X for 1 is off the charts. 2 for 1, 3 for 1, 4 for 1. This is definitely pretty real. Really versatile, really flexible. Grows the Tarmogoyf as always. Gotta love it. Nile Spellbound, so Arcbound Ravager is the big thing that uses their graveyard. They have other things too. When this creature dies, insert text here. I believe that's how the modular 1-drops read, like Arcbound Worker, and And then there's Sparring Construct from Dominaria as well. I know that was in the deck when it first kind of hit the limelight. I don't know if that's always in anymore, but regardless, so like Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Voids shuts off all that stuff. Nihil Spellbomb doesn't. You saw when in game 1, when the Ravager hit the bin, its trigger 1 on the stack, I ate it in response with Scavenging Ooze. The trigger still resolves. So, Nihil Spellbomb, not where we want to be in my opinion. Let's put it over here. Fulminator Mage is actually a maybe. It's actually a maybe just having another land destruction effect against the Inkmoth Nexus is reasonable in my opinion, for sure. That said, I think, so against decks like Infect, this is a definite, right? Because you're playing around Blossoming Defense and similar cards that can effectively counter your removal spells. You're also playing around literal counter magic in Infect. Fulminator Mage is more of a maybe board card against Affinity and Hardened Scales Affinity. Maybe a little bit less appealing in a deck like this, where we have, again, 4 Field of Ruin, we have 4 Assassin's Trophy too. So we might not need it. Still worth considering, though. Maelstrom Pulse for sure comes in. We just want all the removal. Again, big 2-for-1 potential here of this card. We want Golgari Charm as well. They do play a lot of X1s. That said, the windows where this can actually sweep things up are going to be smaller than you might think. On the other hand, it also, the -1/-1 gets around Welding Jar. So, this card is a little bit high variance in terms of how good the -1/-1 is. Can be a huge blowout, can be kind of dead, can be a lot of different permutations of circumstances in between. That said, we still bring it in. Regen can be relevant, but it also hits enchantment, so it's going to hit the namesake card of Hardened Scales. So all those modes considered, it's a nice flexible one to have in. We need to be fast, so no Nissa, no Obstinate Baloth, Choke does nothing. Alright. No to Surgical Extraction, not that type of game. No to Duress. Definite no to Duress because we want to trim away at the discard in the first place, at least to some degree. And, of course, we want to be able to hit the creatures if we can. So Inquisition and Thoughtseize are going to serve us just fine. I do want Collective Brutality. Once again, this is a -X spell that gets around Welding Jar. That's actually very important in this matchup. Also, it's just beyond that, a kill spell that kills literally anything they play. At least before they get a bunch of counters on it. The other modes are also relevant, potentially. Drain is fine for reach and staying alive. And we can spot check them for an Ancient Stirrings if it makes sense to, which it probably won't, to be honest. But if we're forced to keep like a really weird 6-lander with only Brutality and 5 lands, and then we draw a land off the top for our turn, yeah, we'll probably just escalate the Brutality pretty aggressively there. So, not the most relevant mode, the discard mode, but it still comes in basically as a kill spell. Any other use cases, gravy. Now this stuff over here, this stuff's a little tough to rate. So we have 3 cards that are all very interesting in different ways. Let's talk about Kalidas first. 3/4 lifelink for 4 is actually, even though he's designed for creature matchups, he can be a little slow and clunky here. They're just a very fast deck. Lifelink may or may not matter, and realistically, if they're attacking with something along the ground that he can block, it's going to outsize him. That said, the Kalidas actually acts as a rest in peace of sorts for the purposes of their death triggers that I mentioned when I was discussing Nihil Spellbomb. So, definitely some big appeal there. It's making our fatal pushes on stuff like Arcbound Ravager or Arcbound Worker extremely, extremely appealing. Um, yeah, so a little bit tough to rate. Maybe you want to say, he's a little too slow on the draw, he's better on the play. I don't know, he's definitely maybe board. And honestly, I think that's where these Wraths might fall too. You might just want them both, but they are slow, and Languish is actually... They can play around the Languish pretty well with all their counters. They can make some important stuff survive most of the time against a Languish. So maybe we just want the Damnation, but then again, Damnation is symmetrical. That's not necessarily great in a matchup like this where they might be able to fade both Wraths pretty well by just leaning on their manlands. So this stuff is all really hard to rate. We have 4 genuine maybe board cards, and we have 4 cards that for sure come in. So let's start there, and let's see what else is interesting. Worth noting that this is all high curve stuff too, so that's kind of a strike against those things in general. Now let's see what we don't like. Liliana the Veil's pretty medium. There are some sequences when we have a flurry of removal where she can come in and edict something, and it's pretty great, and then taking up is fine, edicting down again is awesome. That said, she is clunky, and she can be very bad just against, servo value. So I like leaving in 1 and cutting 2, personally. With a lot of matchups that fall into this category, I do the same. You can just cut all 3, and that's fine too, but I think you can still leverage exactly 1 Liliana pretty well in the context of all this other removal. This is the type of matchup where I think we can afford to cut a Tireless Tracker because they are just a slow, grindy value card. And since we're going to do that, I think that frees us up to bring in Archelitus. I think that's pretty nice. We're keeping our overall threat count the same, and we don't really want the threat count to go up because we want as many pieces of removal as possible here. So I like that trade. You could also maybe consider cutting a Tassiger for a Fulminator Mage. I don't know how good that is, because Tassiger actually was pretty sweet last game. And again, Fulminator is one of these cards that we might just not need in this specific Golgari shell when they're not playing counter magic to protect their manlands. So, yeah, I think it's certainly viable, but I'd leave it that way for now. That said, we have some discard to cut. I'm pretty happy to do away with these Thought Seizes. That lets us bring in 1 Wrath, and maybe we only want 1. Should it be Languish or Damnation? I legitimately do not know. Let's go with the Damnation, I guess. Just make sure we kill their stuff. It's going to feel really bad if we languish away nothing, because they can move all their counters to an Inkmoth Nexus, then just kill us. So, no, I guess they can under Damnation either as well with certain board states. Man, it's hard to say. Yeah. So here I would say that I'm like a 98%. I'm sure about 98% of this deck, right? But there is this 59 is pretty stock. But you could say none of these come in and we just bring back a Thoughtseize or a Tracker or a Lily or whatever, or all of these come in. Anything in between seems pretty good. I would probably hedge and just play 1 Wrath, no Fulminator, call it good there. And you could even argue for bringing in these 2 and taking out more discard spells, because they can just empty their hand too quick in their bad top decks. But yeah, so like some matchups with this deck, we have a lot of really clear-cut, awesome things to do, and then some things that are a little more gray and might indeed change based on play and draw, and just based on more experience against the matchup. So that's about what sideboarding should look like, though, in my opinion. Please, as always, let me know what your thoughts are. I would be happy to hear them. So let's head over to Game 2, see how we do. Alright, everybody, we are back for Game 2 against Hardened Scales. We are on the draw, and our hand is a little borderline. Inquisition in your opener when you've shaved most of your discard spells, or at least half of them, that's always nice to see, right? Because if you have relatively few discard spells in the 60, seeing one in the opener feels like a piece of good luck. And it's also one fewer bad top deck you can have in the late game. So I like that. Assassin's Trophy is great, and we have a lot of our good sideboard cards here. Not Tracker, but Kalitas and Languish. That said, only 2 lands, little sketchy, to say the least. But I think this is a keep, because if we can disrupt them with Inquisition, we can remove a key piece with Assassin's Trophy. We're on the draw as well, so we're going to see a card right off the top. Turn 1, like, we should be able to reach for a mana, and then one of these cards is going to be fantastic, depending on what their board looks like and what our hand looks like by then. Of course, we have the late game value locked up with Tracker. So the hand is pretty medium, but I do think it is a keep. Opponent will lead on a Relic of Progenitus. Okay. Doesn't worry me much at the moment, but it's definitely an alright one in the matchup. Golgari Charm is a good draw. It could be really nice next turn with some sequences they have, but we still need to see lands, don't we? Definitely need to see some lands. Horizon Canopy. Hardened Scales. Taking one for an Ancient Stirrings. Alright, these are some real cards they're showing us, and they find an Inkmoth Nexus off the Stirrings. Alright, so not a payoff card as far as creatures go, but man, this can get really scary if they have some payoffs in hand. That said, I would love to Inquisition this turn. Blooming Marsh would have been the perfect draw, but we still are bricking on lands, and we drew another clunky late game piece. So I feel obligated here to Golgari Charm. Take away the Hardened Scales. It's still a really good play against anything they could do next turn, getting this namesake card, the extreme value. Things get out of control so quickly on that side of the table with this card around. I think this is the right play. That said, obviously a Blooming Marsh or frankly any untapped land, black land there to go Inquisition, and then Golgari Charm would have been much, much better. Regardless, they will play the Nexus. They will play a Steel Overseer. Alright, you know, they have not really exploded out of the gates, right? They've played some really powerful cards, but they didn't have a Mox Opal. They haven't just vomited out their hand. So this is a game where we would be keeping pace really, really well with them and then just blowing them out of the water in the late game if we could draw land. Sadly, we cannot. So what do? Well, they only have 2 cards in hand. If they have, like, just lands, nothing good, then we are still in a really strong position. If they have some payoff cards, we could be in a really bad position. We will be able to answer the Steel Overseer at some point with this. I think we can afford to take 1 Overseer activation. So my play here, even though it's not mana efficient, is to Inquisition while Inquisition is still alive. Next turn, if we draw a land, we could maybe have a double spell turn of Tarmogoyf Inquisition or something, but they might have an empty hand by then, you know? Okay, so we see 2 cards here that make us both very happy and very sad that we Inquisitioned instead of trophying this turn. Taking away the Hangerback Walker here is fantastic. This is the type of card that gets a lot of value no matter what happens as soon as it hits the board against our deck. So taking it out of the hand is always a win. That said, the fact that they have another Inkmoth Nexus means that their Overseer is going to pump at least 2 things next turn, maybe a third if they draw something here. And they do. They draw an Arcbound Worker. Yep, that's quite bad for us. They get a ton of value here, and they even have enough mana to let one of them attack. So now they've got a pair of relatively scary flying infectors. They've got some decent value along the ground too. And the Overseer is still a must answer. There's our Blooming Marsh, just one turn too late. But we still needed to see that to have a chance, basically. That said, we now can't do anything too great this turn. We obviously cannot afford to just develop our board. We need to spend removal here. So if our option one is to Assassin's Trophy the Steel Overseer. That's kind of bad, because then we have no other removal in hand. Our Languish, even if we hit that 4th mana, does not do anything to these manlands, and they just hit us for 4 Infect next turn, hit us for 4 Infect the following turn, and we're dead. We would need to draw 2 removal spells in a row to not die. That's just not a realistic line. So we have to save this trophy, hit a Nexus next turn, and then potentially going untapped land into Languish, followed by drawing another removal spell, is going to get us there, or a Field of Ruin. That said, we're still pretty far behind because we've bricked on lands for too long. They just draw Mox Opal, which isn't anything we care about anymore, but yeah, what they have on board is bad enough for us. So we get to trophy at least one of these things. They're getting all kinds of value out of that Overseer, and we just draw a Scavenging Ooze. Yep, so we are pretty dead. We're going to play it out. We might as well play the Tarmogoyf, which does not die to Languish. We're not out of it yet. It will die to Languish if they crack the Relic, but of course it makes them crack the Relic. They find another Steel Overseer, so that's still definitely a thing. And yeah, we're just pretty dead now because we need to find a removal spell for this next turn, or we are literally dead. And even if we do, that means we're not languishing, and their board just gets out of control with double Overseer. So let's see what we draw. Another Scooze. Clunk City. Took a trip to Clunk City, and we just got wrecked. Okay. Fair enough. We will scoop it up without doing much that game. I say we didn't do much. I mean, Inquisition was great. Golgari Charm took out their namesake card. That was great. Assassin's Trophy answered to Nexus. Just wasn't enough. They just had, they just get so much power out of these manlands. It's unbelievable. Then again, so does our deck, but not quite on the same level for the most part. But yeah, not much we could do except maybe mulligan our opener. Maybe mulligan looking for a 6 with a lower curve. But I do think it was a reasonable keep, and I think we just got pretty unlucky to A, brick on lands, and 2, just flood on creatures. Like I said in the sideboard tech, we don't want to increase the number of our threats in the deck. We want to keep our interaction numbers as high as possible. Sometimes you just draw them all anyway, even if you didn't increase the numbers at all. So it happens, but let's go to Game 3. We're going to be on the play. That's going to be huge, and see if we can take it down. Okay, my friends, Game 3 against Hardened Scales. Here we are, on the play. This hand is much better. It's still only a 2-lander. We could still brick on lands like we did last time, but our curve is a lot friendlier. We can play out our whole hand except Tracker right now. Our mana is cleaner. There's nothing that ETB tapped. And, of course, Inquisition turn 1 on the play is always really nice against a deck like this where you can really pick out a key card and make their hand crumble. That said, their deck seems to be a little bit more resilient to that than traditional Affinity, but maybe that's a misconception on my part, but that's what I see. Now, look at this hand. It is completely full of gas. They only have 1 land in its Horizon Canopy, so that's a little painful. That life loss on their part could add up, but let's see what we do. So, consideration number 1 is taking away the Mox Opal because it is their big mana accelerant. It makes them dump out their hand potentially a lot more quickly, but they can't do that right away because they don't have an artifact land. If this was a Darksteel Citadel, then that might be a different story, but with Canopy, I'm not inclined to take Opal. Like, we have to grind through their permanents eventually. Like, we're not realistically going to take away their accelerant and then race them. So, and of course, it feels very bad to take a legendary permanent if they can then draw another one. You feel like it was a total waste. So, it's worth considering Opal, but I will say no to that. Also worth considering Stirrings, because it's just the best cantrip in Modern. Can get them whatever they need. I also don't really like taking that when there's an Arcbound Ravager to take. This is arguably the card I fear the most against the deck, so I think we just take the Ravager. I think we just take their best payoff card that's currently in the hand, and we pass. Opponent finds an Inkmoth Nexus off the top, so they are not taking a ton of pain from Canopy, and of course that's just fantastic in the matchup in general. So that was a nice find for them. They're going to play out their Opal, of course, and pass to us. We find a third land. Feels good. Feels good. I chose to just aggressively fetch and shock here. It's the only time we'll have to do it. The 3 life, I don't think it's going to come back to bite us because we do have a Scavenging Ooze, and Infect damage seems like a more realistic win condition for them anyway. We just get to grow the Tarmogoyf. It's just, again, I mentioned in Game 1, I don't know if they play Dismember in the 75, but if they do and if it's in, this is actually safe from Dismember for now. Artifact, creature, sorcery, land. Dismember would be an instant, making it a 5/6. Don't know if that's something to play around, but I did. And, you know, getting double green and double black, just making the Goyf bigger, that's all very good. So, opponent plays a Horizon Canopy. Opponent finds another Arcbound Ravager. Alright. Alright, that's a good one. And they're going to play the Worker. They're going to get the board wide. When you play the Ravager, you want to play as many creatures alongside it as possible. So that is why they sequenced accordingly. It's good sequencing from them. Field of Ruin's a fine draw. Definitely not upset about that one. Here we get to hold up Fatal Push in case they get really crazy right out of the gates with their Ravager activations and just get in with our 4/5. They're not going to. They're just going to throw a modular creature in front of it. Okay, so I was kind of hoping that what they would do here is put the trigger on the Arcbound Ravager, then I could push the Ravager in response. They would have to respond by sacking the Ravager to the remaining Worker, and if I understand it correctly, they would miss a trigger. They would miss this trigger, then that counter. That said, perhaps because they know to play around stuff like that, they put it on the Arcbound Worker instead of the Ravager. I'm still just going to Fatal Push the Ravager because I just want to force them to activate this as soon as possible before their board gets any bigger. I think that's just the way to handle that most of the time. Goyf is now a 5/6 as well, because we've got an instant in the yard. Feels really good to have such a big threat so early. And we get to play out our Scavenging Ooze. It's a backup threat. It's going to gain us a bunch of life. It's going to get big as well. We're looking pretty good here. Find a Welding Jar. Okay, that would have been really nice for them last turn. But then again, they found the Ravager itself last turn. Now they get to fire off Ancient Stirrings. They take a Darksteel Citadel. Probably not super thrilled by that, but it does at least give them some more mana sources so they can realistically take advantage of things like Animation Module if they find it, so they can cast their XX creatures for bigger, etc., etc. And they've got a 3/3 just kind of holding the line, but they've got a lot of really good stuff back here, back behind where the creatures line up. So they're representing another draw. They have this Inkmoth Nexus that they're going to just load all of these modular counters onto if and when this dies. They've also got Throne of Geth, tap, sack, and artifact, proliferate. So the Darksteel Citadel also is going to be fuel for that. Again, this can just make their counters get out of control. It's a really kind of strange, little bit innocuous looking card, but this is just a nice little engine for the deck a lot of the time. Collective Brutality is an okay draw. It's a little sad to see it now that their only creature as of now has outclassed it, but with subsequent creatures off the top, this can be a good answer to them that gets through Welding Jar. Could become relevant, but for now, it's time to just get in with the Tarmogoyf. I could get in with a Skooz as well, because I'm bluffing the I'm bluffing the Skooz activations getting bigger, etc. But I just want to continue developing my board while I can. And in this case, developing my board is going to mean just playing out my Field of Ruin, because this Inkmoth Nexus is something that is out of nowhere a 5/5. This is a 2-turn clock out of nowhere with evasion. So I cannot afford to do anything here except Field of Ruin. Now, I'm going to hold up the field, and we will see why when they move to attacks. So they're going to move to attacks. Here comes the Nexus. We both knew I was going to field this the whole time, but we're going to do it now. Now, he's going to be able to keep it alive with Welding Jar, but the way Regenerate wording is the card is tapped and removed from combat, something to that effect. So we actually, the fact that we force him to regen here, it kind of acts as a fog for the turn, which is kind of cool. Definitely a good one to know about. Regen is, I believe it's a keyword that they've kind of done away with. I don't think they're going to be including it in future sets because it's a little unintuitive, and a lot of people just simply don't know that part of the ruling. They find a Hardened Scales. That was their draw for turn. We're going to gobble up some stuff with these. Hardened Scales is potentially good. That said, I'm kind of glad it's not another way to protect the Inkmoth Nexus. That is for sure. So we've got a big clock on board. We've got a 2-turn clock as things stand. We're just going to get our tracker down. It's another body. It adds to the clock. And it also provides us with a clue, which can be important if we just need to find answers next turn. It just gives us another chance at doing so besides our draw for turn. So we get to get in for 10. They're also dead now to tracker and either creature, even if we don't crack a clue. So they've interesting. They're going to fire up the Nexus on the end step. They're going to proliferate. And Hardened Scales makes that a 2. That makes sense because they could, in theory, find some stuff off the top that just makes this lethal with the Hardened Scales around. So they chose to do that instead of cracking the Canopy for a draw. They find Ancient Stirrings for a turn, and they find a Relic of Progenitus off Ancient Stirrings. That can shrink the Goyf, but it's just not going to be good enough, So they could play the Relic with Darksteel Citadel. Then they cannot afford to both crack the Relic to shrink the Goyf down to the point where it doesn't do anything and fire up the Inkmoth Nexus on defense. They would have to pick one, and if they only pick one, they are dead either way. So, opponent scoops it up. They were very, very close. They were 1 mana shy there of being able to crack a Relic, block something with the Inkmoth, and potentially not be dead. Now that said, we did have Hissing Quagmire, Collective Brutality. Potentially seeing 2 cards, we could have pushed it through. Either way, even though we finished the game completely unscathed at 20 life and 0 poison, that was a very close game. They had a 7/7 Inkmoth Nexus waiting in the wings that was almost like they almost just killed us. They got very close. So this is a matchup that dances on a knife's edge a lot of the time. There's no question about it. They can go under us. They can go over us, surprisingly, both in terms of kind of going wide and getting a lot of grindy value, or in terms of making creatures that are even bigger than our Tarmogoyfs. They can do it, and they can go literally over us by flying over the top with Inkmoth Nexi for the win. So that's one reason that Hardened Scales Affinity is such a strong deck, is because cards like Throne of Geth enable them to adopt their strategy to whatever makes the most sense at the time. And of course, they are still able to do the traditional Affinity style nut draws where they just kill you on turn 3 and there's not much you can do about it. So definitely a tough deck to play and to play against. Definitely a really fun 3 matches here. I do really enjoy decks like this, playing against decks like this on BG Rock. It is a challenge, and our stuff lines up well, but it doesn't line up well in the sense like, oh, you just can't do anything about this. Like, a Fatal Push is always good, but it's going to have very different results and prompt a very different sequence on the part of the opponent, depending on what else is going on. So, definitely a rewarding matchup to participate in my opinion. I'm a big fan of their deck, and I'm glad that we got there. So, as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoy the content, please consider giving me a subscribe. That is the best metric by which I can measure my impact and my popularity. So, really appreciate the likes and the comments. Really appreciate the subscribe above all. And thanks again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you for the next video.